Hi everyone and welcome to Chapter 33, which focuses on animal form as well as homeostasis. And with this chapter, you'll notice that there's a lot of terminology, so I've included some extra recap slides, a few more than usual, to kind of serve as a sort of closed captioning for the things that I'm saying. So when you get to those slides, you can pause and jot down the notes, almost word for word exactly how I said them, just so that in case you miss anything or were uncertain of any spelling, it might help you out. Now, with animal forms, the first thing we want to talk about is the fact that there are multiple body plans when it comes to animal structure. So body plans basically means the symmetry of the animal. So how, is one side symmetrical to the other? Is there any kind of repeat or mirror aspect to that organism? Now, the three main body plans that you encounter are asymmetry, radial symmetry, and bilateral symmetry. What that means, if something is asymmetrical, it means that animal has no pattern or symmetry whatsoever. And the usual example that you'll see is a marine sponge. So things like coral, like we see in this picture here. If you cut it down one way or cut it across one way, the sides that you cut will not look similar to each other. Radial symmetry, on the other hand, is for any of the organisms that basically have an up and down orientation. And in a way, you can think of it as symmetry around a central axis. So if you cut any plane on that organism, whether it's longitudinal or latitudinal, you basically will produce equal halves to it, no matter which direction you're cutting in. And the big example of a central symmetry, meaning radial symmetry, is a starfish, or even if you look at a tulip flower. Okay, starfish or tulip flower will help you visualize that circular kind of symmetry. The last one, bilateral symmetry, that's actually what we have. It's the property of being divisible into symmetrical halves on either side of the plane. So, for instance, as you can see in this picture here, bilateral symmetry, it creates a left and a right side that match each other. Okay, they are symmetrical in that half kind of fashion. In addition to body plans, there are also body planes, and that's basically looking at how you divide the body up. So any standing vertebrate animal can basically be divided into several planes, and this is what I was talking about in the first slide, how there's a lot of terminology here, and you have to make sure that in this chapter, anytime you see any of these terms, you understand what it means, okay, what it would look like. So if you are told a sagittal plane, what that means, sagittal, is dividing the body into the left and right portions. And if it's a mid-sagittal line, then it is directly in the half portion of that organism. Okay? It's exactly in the middle, making two equal left and right sides to that organism. Okay, so you notice in this picture as well, the sagittal plane cuts the body into a left and a right side. Frontal plane, however, that sometimes you'll see called a coronal plane. That's now separating the front from the back. Okay, so it's nice that it's kind of in its term, you can tell that it's giving you a front half of the body and a back half of the body. Transverse plane, that's the last one. And transverse, anytime you see the term trans or transverse in biology, it means across. So the transverse plane is cutting across the organism in a horizontal fashion. And that means that it's cutting to give you an upper portion and a lower portion. Okay, so the trick to kind of remembering the body planes is first think of frontal plane, since that tells you right in the word front, right? So it tells you that there's front and back. Transverse, when you see trans, think of cross. So it cuts across the body, gives you an up and down, and that leaves sagittal as the last one, which gives you a left and a right side. The last type of division that we can talk about with the animal form or structure is basically the body cavities. And body cavities means where you'll find various organs. And there are two main categories for how to divide the body cavities. There are the ventral cavities, and then there are the dorsal cavities. And as you can see in these figures, ventral means the cavity is on your front side. So if you think of your chest, your abdomen, the genital region, all of those are the ventral part of your body. Whereas dorsal means any of the cavities on your back side. And a way to remember that is if you've ever heard the term dorsal fin. So if you've heard of a dorsal fin, that's the big fin on the back of a shark or a whale or a dolphin. Okay? Then within each of these main categories of ventral being front, dorsal being back, you have the individual body cavities, which include the thoracic, the abdominal, the pelvic in the front of your body, and then in the back you have the cranial and the vertebral, okay, your vertebrae. Now, like I said, that was a lot of terminology, so here's a recap slide for you to pause and jot down any of what I said. Now we get into the function a little bit in terms of how that animal is actually working. And one of the categories for how animals function is their bioenergetics. And there's two terms you have to be able to distinguish between. There's endotherms and there are ectotherms. Now, as soon as you see a word, if you kind of start to break down the word in terms of what you know, it'll help you get to what it's trying to say a little quicker. So, for instance, both of these you see therm. And whenever you hear therm or thermo, that means you're dealing with heat in one way or another. Okay? Now, if you think about it, animals get energy from food, and they store some energy, but that process, the metabolic processes are not 100% efficient. So they end up losing some energy, and they do so in the form of heat a lot of times, heat or excreted wastes. So these two terms are talking about how the animal deals with their heat. So endotherms, when you hear endo, that means within, right? So if you think about an endotherm, well, they could keep their heat within them. Basically meaning endotherms are any animals that can conserve that heat and basically maintain a constant body temperature. So we call them warm-blooded. And what's a big example or a great example of an endotherm? You, right? You and me, humans, we're endotherms. We have a relatively constant body temperature, and we know if something's wrong with us in terms of health, okay? We know if something's wrong with us if that body temperature is suddenly not staying stable and regulated. Now, the alternative is to be an ectotherm. And in ectotherms, they basically don't have the usual fur, fat, feathers that really insulate and conserve body heat the way that endotherms do. So in that absence of insulation, such as, a lot of the reptiles, things like snakes are ectotherms, they basically don't have a stable, steady, constant body temperature, and they're very greatly affected by the environment temperature around them. Okay, and that can modify their metabolic rates and their metabolic reactions. Now, a trick to remembering which is which, in addition to thinking endotherms, meaning within heat, so keeping that heat within, you can also circle the C of ectotherms and remind yourself cold-blooded. Ectotherms are the cold-blooded organisms such as snakes and various reptiles. Now, when we talk about temperatures and heat and metabolism, all that fun stuff, if you think about it, you know, there can end up being quite bad or adverse, extreme kind of temperatures and environments for various animals. So throughout time, they had to make these adaptations to make sure that they're better, you know, stable, better evolved for dealing with temperature and heat problems, as well as food availability. Because think about it, some seasons, some time periods, not only is the temperature unfavorable, but because of that, there are fewer animals and plants around for you to eat, okay? So something called torpor exists, and torpor means a decrease in activity and metabolism, so meaning all the reactions in that animal's body, that allows an animal to survive those adverse or extreme conditions. Now, the two big examples of torpor are hibernation and estivation. Now, everyone has heard of hibernation, but not so many people have heard of the term estivation. So what these mean, hibernation is the form of torpor where the organism will have that decreased activity and decreased metabolism over a long period of time. And what's the example that you usually think of? Winter time. For organisms such as bears, right? They like to hibernate in the winter time when conditions are not so great, it's cold temperatures, and there's not much food available for them. Okay, so hibernation is torpor over a long period of time. Estivation, on the other hand, is torpor that's specific to extremely high temperatures and low water availability. Okay, so estivation means organisms that will decrease their activity and their metabolic rates to better survive extreme heat and low water availability. And the organisms that tend to do this are some arthropods and crustaceans, so those are the crunchy shell organisms, as well as a lot of reptiles and amphibians. Now again, this is one of those slides where you can pause the recording and jot down any of the terminology and definitions I just gave. So now moving on in terms of animal structure and function. When you think of an animal structure, a big part of what makes up that animal is their tissues. And if you remember when we went through the levels of organization, tissues fall right there. They ultimately are what make up your organs. And there are 4 tissues that I want you to know the difference amongst. So we have epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous tissues. Now, epithelial, a lot of times people think automatically skin for epithelial, your epithelium, which is good to think of because your epithelial tissues are your body surfaces. They're also your cavities and your glands. And we're going to go into more detail in a minute what we mean by that, a few more examples. You then have your connective tissues, and as the name basically suggests, connective tissues will bind together body parts, and they bind and support these body parts. Muscular, again, just like the name suggests, you've all heard of muscles. These are for moving your body parts. And then nervous, other than you guys, when you have your exams, nervous tissues, these are the tissues that receive stimuli and then transmit impulse responses. So they're very important in terms of signal transduction, meaning getting signals across your body and getting organs to do what you want them to do. So for instance, getting even your body parts to move around. Yes, the muscles are what makes them move, but the nervous tissue is what gives them the signal when to move. So now I want to go through each of the tissues one by one. And the first one we're going to talk about is epithelial tissue. And if you kind of think of skin, even though that's not the only example, if you think of skin for epithelial, then that'll help you think of the function. So the two main functions of epithelial tissue is one, to be a protective barrier, so to physically protect whatever organs they're covering. And two is for permeability. And we've already talked about the plasma membrane. So you already know that permeability means getting things such as molecules in and out of a structure. Okay, so protective barrier and permeability are the functions of epithelial tissue. Now there are three types of epithelium. There's simple, complex, and glandular. What simple means, when you see simple, think single, okay? So SI in simple, think SI in single. So it's usually a single layer of cells. And then the shapes can be classified as squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. And the way that you see these is over here, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar, okay? So you can get an idea of the smaller, kind of flatter squamous. Cuboidal is like a cube, so more square shaped. And then columnar is now like a longer column shaped. We then have the idea of complex epithelia, okay? And complex epithelia would be more like over here where you're seeing the stratified form of epithelia. And what stratified is a fancy way of saying layered. Okay, notice in each of these stratified examples you have more than one layer. So simple was only a single layer, and now you have multiple layers in stratified complex epithelial. Okay, you then have glandular epithelia. And that's epithelia that can secrete products, okay? If you think of your glands, they're secreting. So it makes sense that glandular is now the epithelial tissue that secretes stuff. And you can break that down into exocrine or endocrine. And the difference being exocrine glands, they secrete their products into ducts, okay? And that's duct as in D-U-C-T, not as in the quack quack kind, okay? Then you have endocrine glands instead. They secrete directly into the bloodstream, okay? So you have exocrine into ducts because that's going outside into those ducts, and then endocrine is going directly in the bloodstream, okay? Now again, here's a recap in case you missed any of what I was saying or any spelling. Then we move on to the connective tissues. And the connective tissues are the most abundant tissue. So you may want to circle, star, highlight, because you notice that's in red and bold and underline. So it may come up again. Now, just like with the epithelial, when we talk about connective tissue, there's multiple forms of connective tissue. There's fibrous, supportive, and fluid, okay? Which is funny because usually when you think of fluids, you don't think tissues, but fluids can be tissues as well because they're made up of multiple cells working together. So first we have fibrous connective tissue. And the loose fibrous connective tissues, those are the tissues that allow organs to expand. Then you have adipose, and if you've ever heard that term before, that usually means fat, right? Adipose is fatty tissue. And when you think of fats, then you think of stored energy, okay? So adipose is a primary energy reserve. Then you have dense fibrous tissue, and if they're dense, they're the tendons and the ligaments, okay? That helps keep some of your structures together. You also have supportive connective tissues, okay? And you see a lot of fancy terms there like hyaline, elastic, fibrocartilage. That's all fancy way of saying that these supportive connective tissues are all part of your framework to your body. under supportive connective tissue, the one that I really want you to remember is the fact that your bone is a connective tissue. Okay, because just like I said, fluids you don't usually think of as tissues. A lot of people don't think of bones as tissues because they're solid. And in the case of bones, what I want you to write is that they are the most rigid connective tissue. Okay? And then we get to the fluid connective tissues, and the big important one is your blood. And your blood is made up of multiple cells that we're going to talk about throughout this semester, including when we go through the immune system. And in the blood, you have red blood cells, and those are critical to transporting oxygen and nutrients to all of the other parts of your body. Then you have the white blood cells, and you know these as your defenders. They fight infections. They are a critical aspect of your immune system. And they can either produce antibodies to help protect you, or they could be big bad guys themselves and directly engulf pathogens, meaning they can swallow up other cells to get rid of them and break them down. And again, we'll talk more about them in the immune chapter. Your blood also has what's called platelets and lymph. The platelets are what clot. So they're important for clotting in your body. Again, something we'll talk about in the immune system. And then lymph is the fluid of the immune system that goes around. And if you end up getting an infection in your blood or specifically in your lymph, you end up having big problems and you have, sepsis issues. Again, something that we'll talk about in a later chapter. Now, in addition to knowing the different types of connective tissues and examples, I also want you to know the functions. Now, the good part about knowing the functions is that if you remember the examples that we just talked about, that'll help you think of the functions, okay? Because first of all, we talked about things like bones and hyaline and all of those elastic fibrocartilage, that kind of stuff. That would help you realize that one of the first functions is to establish a structural framework for the body of that organism. Okay? Connective tissue, just like we talked about in the blood, is also important for transporting fluids and dissolved materials. So that connects to the idea of getting things where they need to be, including oxygen that we talked about with the blood. So it's for transport. Connective tissues such as adipose. Remember we mentioned fat. Well, in addition to being energy, fat is very important for protecting. So protecting delicate organs is the third function. Okay, so we have structural, transporting, protecting, also supporting the body and the organs and basically surrounding and interconnecting other tissues in your body. Again, relating to the concept of the adipose and fat, connective tissue function includes storing energy reserves. And the last one is my personal favorite since I love microbiology. All those white blood cells that we talked about and lymph that we talked about, what did we say those help with? Your immune system. So defending your body from microorganisms, pathogens such as bacteria, viruses, fungi, that's part of connective tissue function. Okay, so function includes structure, transport, protection, supporting structures as well, storing energy, and defending the body as part of the immune system. That was a whole lot of words for me to say, so I wrote it down again as if I'm closed captioning this lesson because I want to make sure that you get all of the key points and the spelling as well. So you can always pause on these slides to jot down your notes. And then we move on to muscular tissue. It's all about those gains, right? So with muscular tissue, these are basically made up of actin and myosin. And those are contractile. They basically work like if you picture being in a rowboat and using an oar to move yourself through that water, that's kind of how it looks with actin and myosin contracting and easing up to help you move the different parts of your body. Now, there are 3 types of muscular tissue, and I want you to know their function and where you might find them. So the first one is skeletal muscle. Their function is for voluntary movements, because think about it, you can move your skeleton, right? You can move your arms and legs. It's voluntary. So these would be your long striated muscles. So long striated muscles is what we see here, okay? Striations being those layers that we talked about in previous terminology as well. You then have smooth muscles, and smooth muscles are involuntary. So they're involved in moving organs, but that you wouldn't even think of or realize that that's occurring. There are no striations on these, meaning you don't have those lines drawn all throughout them. And basically, these are ones such as you'll find in your digestive tract or your blood vessels. So if you think about it, your blood vessels, if you get cold, you start shivering, you're trying to warm your body up. When you're cold, you have what's called vasoconstriction occur. And vasoconstriction means your blood vessels have squeezed up, they're trying to conserve their energy and heat, and they're increasing the pumping, the flow, your blood pressure to kind of warm up. Whereas when you're hot, your veins open up. They dilate, vasodilation. Now, these are important things, that constriction and that dilation movement, but you don't voluntarily do them. Your body does it on its own. It's involuntary movement because it's smooth muscle of the blood vessels. The other type of muscular tissue that is involuntary is cardiac muscles, okay? You find that in the walls of the heart, and its function is to contract and pump blood in your heart and to give you a heartbeat and to force that blood out of your heart to every other part of your body. Okay, so very, very important muscle as well. So when you think of muscular tissue, make sure you remember skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle. Here is a quick recap for you to jot down your notes. And then we move on to the last one, which is nervous tissue. Okay, nerve-wracking, I know. So nervous tissue, that's the one that's all about electrical impulses and sending signals throughout your body. So sending signals between tissues and different organs. Now, it's made up of 2 main types of cells called neurons and your glia. Sometimes you see them as neuroglia. Sometimes you just see them as glia itself, okay? Same thing. Now, first up, we have the neurons. They are basically made up of 3 parts. Each neuron is a dendrite. So dendrite, you see here, those little extensions here. It's also a cell body, which is the big structure here that houses the nucleus. And then an axon, which is the long structure you see here. Okay, so every neuron will have dendrites, a cell body, and an axon. And what their function is to do is to transmit signals. Specifically, they are part of 3 main functions called sensory input, integration of data, and motor output. Okay, so sensory input means taking in a signal, let's say from another part of your body. Integration of data is basically them analyzing what that signal means. What is that other body part trying to tell me? And then motor output is their reaction to it, the actual movement that they trigger. Then you have the neuroglia, and they outnumber the neurons, meaning there are a whole lot more glia than there are neurons. And that's because their function is to support and nourish those neurons. They basically maintain homeostasis, or meaning equilibrium and balance, in the nervous system with their various secretions that they can put out. Okay, so neurons are the ones involved in the main signals of the nervous system. And then the neuroglia are the ones involved in supporting and nourishing and keeping those neurons stable. Okay, again, here's one of the recaps that I promised you to pause and jot down your notes. Now, we went through all 4 of the types of tissues. Then what's important is the next level of hierarchy, that organ concept. So these tissues are many cells working together for a common goal. These tissues then combine and work together themselves to form an organ, and then many of those organs work together to make up an organ system. And there are a lot of different organ systems that we're going to cover in this semester, including the respiratory system, cardiovascular, reproductive system. That's the one everyone pays attention to. And with all of these systems, they basically have their own specific life process, meaning their own purpose, their own function. So for instance, the respiratory system, it's multiple organs working together to make sure that you are breathing, that you are getting the oxygen you need and getting rid of the carbon dioxide you don't need. Okay? The cardiovascular system is many organs working together for the common goal of transporting materials. And if you think about it, those materials are usually blood and specifically oxygen, okay? Oxygen throughout the blood as well. So it's connected to the respiratory system. And they all work together to make you the person that you are. So even though there are a whole bunch of organ systems and organs that we'll talk about throughout this course, one that I want to highlight right now is the skin. A lot of people think of skin as just a tissue, but it's actually an organ. Okay, so it's made up of some of the tissues that we talked about working together. Now, when you think of skin, I'm sure a lot of you take your skin for granted because it's there and it's always there. Okay, it would be horrifying if it wasn't. But when you think of skin, I want you to think about what it's really doing for you. And it actually does a lot for you. So one, it covers and protects your body, which is one of the most obvious of its functions. But it also does things like regulating your body temperature, which we'll talk about a little later. And it contains sensory receptors. And you know that because if you've ever cut your finger like with a paper cut, it hurts. It hurts a lot because there are a lot of sensory receptors in your skin as well. Now, there are 2 main regions that I want you to know associated with skin. There's the epidermis and the dermis. So epidermis is your top layer of skin, and that's the real protector or protection of your body. It also produces melanin, and that's what gives you your skin pigment, so the coloring of your skin. Right below that is your dermis, and the dermis is the deeper and thicker layer of the skin. So when you see dermis, D-E, think deep. That's the deeper and thicker layer, and that's what will contain the hair follicles, the glands, things like those receptors and nerves that I said cause pain when you get a paper cut, and also all the blood vessels, that's circulating blood right below your skin. Now, right underneath your dermis, there's what's called the subcutaneous layer. A lot of people don't consider this as actually part of the skin. It's just right below it. And this is loose connective tissue. And as you already know, what's an example of connective tissue? Adipose, right? So a lot of it is adipose, fatty tissue. Okay, so it's a storage layer and a fatty tissue layer. Once again, here's another recap slide to help you jot down everything that I was just saying. Now, the last part of this chapter, I want to give you a little idea about homeostasis. Now, technically, homeostasis will come back in a lot of the other chapters when we talk about how all of the different systems are functioning and maintaining their balance. But in general, I want you to know that homeostasis, or the maintenance and constant steady state in your body, trying to keep you stable and balanced, that homeostasis relies on two main mechanisms. There's negative feedback and there's positive feedback. And negative feedback is something that you probably remember from when we talked about enzymes. Negative feedback is actually the most common form of homeostasis. So circle, star, highlight negative feedback as the most common form of homeostasis. And as I wrote there, this response is opposite of the stimulus. And the example that we like to use with negative feedback is the regulation of your body temperature. So for instance, before I mentioned, what happens when you get really hot. If there's an increase in temperature, think about what your body starts to do, right? You start sweating. You start having vasodilation, that dilation of blood vessels, which is why all of a sudden your face, your skin looks really red or pink. You turn red because your blood vessels are dilating, meaning they're opening up, they're getting bigger and bigger, which means they're getting closer to the surface of your skin. That's why you suddenly appear red. Now, the reason why your body does things like sweating and dilating, opening up those blood vessels, is it's trying to decrease the temperature. Okay, so that's a negative feedback mechanism because the stimulus was an increase in temperature. So your body responded with the opposite. It tried to decrease temperature. Okay, now sometimes in very few cases, instead of having a negative feedback mechanism, your body uses positive feedback mechanisms. Now, like I emphasized, these are much less common, but they exist. And one of the examples is uterine contractions. When a woman is going into labor and having birth, uterine contractions trigger the release of what's called oxytocin. Oxytocin being one of the things that they call a mommy hormone or pregnancy hormone. And that then increases the uterine contractions for giving birth. Okay, so in this case, it's positive feedback because the stimulus is the initial uterine contraction, which then triggers the response of the production of oxytocin, which increases uterine contractions. So it's the same direction as the stimulus was, rather than being the opposite. Okay, so negative feedback gives the opposite reaction. Positive feedback gives the same reaction to enhance the stimulus. So here is a visual representation of what we were talking about with negative feedback. The idea of if your body suddenly senses an increase in temperature, what are some of the things that your body will then do to respond to it? Well, it will direct the response of things like vasodilation and sweating to then decrease that temperature. And in the opposite side of things, which we didn't mention, if the temperature drops instead, well, in a negative feedback, if the stimulus is a decrease in temperature, what will your body do in response? It will try to increase temperature because it's the opposite. So a decreased temperature will trigger your body trying to increase temperature. And the way that it does that would be things like vasoconstriction. Remember I said when the veins get really tight and narrow and really increase the flow and blood pressure, pumping that through your body, and even something like shivering, trying to get that mechanical warmth. That's part of negative feedback. Okay, because any of those responses are trying to get the opposite of what triggered them. And then lastly, we have the visual of the positive feedback. So as I mentioned, the idea with this is positive goes in the same direction. So if the stimulus was uterine contractions, then that triggers, here's the spelling of it, that triggers the release of oxytocin. And since it is positive feedback, that increase in uterine contractions will trigger an even greater increase in uterine contractions. And the point of that positive feedback is to try and push that baby out, get it out of the body. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in the reproductive chapter. That is it for this chapter. As always, when you finish up a chapter, make sure to have added the information from this chapter into your weekly study guide, and also start jotting down what questions you would like to ask other students on the discussion board. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please contact me in the Remind app. Like I always say, I have no life. So anytime, never hesitate to ask me a question. Thank you and have a great day.